Today's video is about how to increase WordPress image speed. So briefly, we're going to run through why that's important and also what actually slows the image time. So what slows that down? And then I'm going to explain to you how to actually improve that. And these are among some of the techniques that I use to get a WordPress site to load within under 1 second. If you enjoy these kind of tips and you're trying to improve the performance of your online marketing, then subscribe right now because there are lots more tips coming up over the next few weeks. So why is page speed important? Well, we live in a mobile first world, so there are lots of users that are actually using a mobile device and they'll be on a 3G connection rather than 4G. So when we talk about load times of sub 3 seconds on a mobile device, we're talking about that in terms of unthrottled bandwidth. So we can always use that as a benchmark because we're not in control of a user's connectivity, but just consider that's unthrottled. So if a user is on a 3G connection, that might be actually double that speed or even triple. And users are used to that, but if your load time on mobile on unthrottled is like 18 seconds, which is typical of a lot of sites actually, that means it's taking possibly nearly a minute to load. Your users have left your website before that happens. And imagine even if they do get to your website and they're browsing products through your WooCommerce store, and every page is taking 20, 30, 40, or even 15 seconds to load. That's tiring, it's exhausting, it's frustrating. They are going to leave your website and not buy anything. So fundamentally, page load time, website speed, improves conversion rates. You get more sales with a faster website for the exact same amount of traffic. So if you are investing in search engine optimization, in email marketing, in social media marketing, in pay-per-click, with Google Shopping, with Google Ads, with Bing Ads, any of those, if you're paying for those clicks, wouldn't you like to get 50% more sales for that same spend? That's what page speed can do for you. So what slows load time for your images on WordPress or WooCommerce? So fundamentally, the file size itself, remember that browser has to download the whole image. If it's a 2 megabyte image, it's got to download the whole thing and then possibly resize it. So that's completely unnecessary. Those images could be compressed to make the file smaller or presented with a smaller image where only a smaller image is needed. So also, when do those images render? So obviously on a mobile device or even on a desktop device, there's lots of scrolling that happens. So what typically happens is the entire page loads and then we get to see it and then we can scroll. So why are we loading all these pages, all these images that aren't even on the page yet? So stopping that happening also would speed things up. Fundamentally, the server that your website is hosted on and where your images are hosted is going to have some impact on how quick your images load, of course, or where your images are hosted themselves. So you don't have to host your images on the same physical server as your website. More on that in a moment. So how to increase WordPress image speed, and this also applies to WooCommerce. So there are a handful of plugins I'm just going to walk you through today. So the first plugin that I want to show you is one called Smush, and this smushes images. Okay, there are other plugins that will do this in the WordPress plugin directory, but this is the one that I use quite commonly and it works very, very well. So what Smush does is it compresses your images. So with any image, there's quite a lot of wasted space and data. So you might have typically a 1 meg image size, and what Smush will do is compress that image without losing the quality of that of the image itself to make that file size smaller. So that is going to mean the data transfer size from your server to the user's browser is going to be reduced. So this will just go through and smush all of your images. The second thing that it does is it creates multiple versions of that image with different dimensions. So if you can imagine you're on a desktop device and there's your nice big image, well, what if you're on a device with a smaller screen? you only need an image this big. And if you're on a mobile device, maybe that image is this big. It's tiny. And without this kind of method, what's happening is the mobile user is landing on your website. Here's an image that's this big. It downloads the whole thing. Nice big 1 meg image, or even smushed, even compressed. Maybe it's 800K, maybe it's 700K, but it's still this big. But actually then the mobile device, the browser is then saying, well, I've got this huge image. Thank you very much for wasting my time. But now I'm going to resize it to this big, which is only a, I don't know, 40K image or 30. So why don't we just serve them a 30K image in the first place, which will speed up delivery and therefore load time. Smush also does that, so very clever, and that significantly increases page load time through improving and optimizing the images for your products in WooCommerce or for WordPress if you're doing more lead generation. The second type of plugin I want to talk about is it addresses the what we call lazy loading. So what lazy loading is, as I mentioned before, we have images that are kind of below the fold, they're off the screen. So what lazy loading does is it defers loading of those images until the user begins to scroll. So when we talk about page speed, what's most important is the time to first meaningful content paint. So when can a user start using that information? When can they start looking at those images? When can they start reading your content? So the fact that a page actually takes 6 seconds to load on a mobile rather than 3 doesn't matter if I can see that content within that first 3 seconds. That's what's important. So let's give them something to view within 3 seconds or 2 seconds or 6 or whatever it is. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that can keep happening in the background whilst I start to consume that content. So the user gets to use the website while there's still other stuff happening. And what lazy load does is defers the loading of those images. So maybe you've got a slider which kind of rolls 4 images in the header. It loads the first one, I can see that. I've got usable information, usable data, usable content. Then I can load in the background image 2, image 3, image 4 in your slider, or maybe those product images a bit further down the page. And lazy loading effectively defers that. And there are a bunch of WordPress plugins that will do that for you too. The final plugin that I want to talk about is a little bit more advanced, and you will need access to your DNS records and things like that, ideally. So think about your server hosting. You might be on a shared hosting platform, which means the resources of your server are being shared with other websites. That means that if those other websites are particularly busy, they're making lots of requests to the server, and that's going to slow down requests to your website as well, which slows down the images loading. So you might want to think about just how good is my hosting, think about a dedicated box rather than shared hosting. There are a bunch of options there. There are costs involved, but if you think about that increase in conversion rates and return on ad spend, if you're doing Google Shopping, the cost of that hosting versus the uplift in sales is really, really worth it. The cost of hosting is fairly cheap, let's be honest. But this is more about not your website hosting, but image hosting. So there are a bunch of services that do this, and a number of different plugins that offer this as well, or you could manually code it. But today I'm just going to talk about one, which is called Offload Media. So I implemented this. It took me quite a bit of fiddling, and messing about with CDNs and all this kind of stuff. But essentially what it does is it takes all of your images, let's assume you've smushed them and they're smaller files and we've got all those other optimization techniques done, but it takes your images and it puts them onto Amazon Web Services. Okay, so in their help will explain this in much more detail, but very briefly what it does is it takes all of your images from your WordPress site. You create an Amazon Web Services account, you create a bucket in there, you put all of your images in that bucket, and that transfer process just is automated. So you can configure that and it will push all your images up into Amazon Web Services. By default, what that means is all of the image addresses within your WordPress site or your WooCommerce site, instead of being WP uploads, whatever, they'll now be on a big, ugly Amazon SW3, big, long, ugly URL. And the images are no longer on your domain, but they are much faster loading. So the next thing that you then do is use, again within Amazon Web Services, use CloudFront, which is a content delivery network, and you map CloudFront to that bucket in Amazon Web Services. So now we have CloudFront address, and CloudFront CDN effectively takes all of your images, your content, and it propagates those around lots of servers all around the web. So the user is only connecting to the server nearest to them to request those images. So that means it doesn't matter where in the world they are, they're going to connect to an Amazon server with effectively a copy of your images, which makes them, again, load much, much faster because there's less physical distance between their connection and the server they're connecting to. The final thing to then do is to go into your DNS records. So this is into domain names, so wherever you manage your domain name, and creating a CNAME to give it a friendly name and say, well, actually images.domain.com is on the CDN, which means now the URLs for all of your images will be images.domain.co.uk. So all of your images are now within your domain, so that's nice and SEO friendly, but they're going through the CloudFront CDN and on Amazon Web Services, which means they are lightningly quick. So those are, there are a few involved things there. Maybe I'll do another show sometime on the specifics of how to do that. But I managed to get a site from 12 seconds. This is a WordPress site, from a load time of 12 seconds on mobile down to under 3 seconds using all of those techniques that I just described. Do subscribe for more videos coming up. If you have any questions about how to do some of this stuff, or if you're stuck, or if you just want to say, great video, really helped, I managed to get my site down to 2 seconds and you beat me, brilliant. I'd love to hear from you, but happy smushing.